G'day, I'm Gary Stevens, and welcome to the third season of the History in the Bible podcast. In this final season, I explore how the Jews and the Christians constructed new religions when they were sent spinning into the void after the destruction of the temple. All of the history about all of the books beyond the Bible. Episode 3.16 Quest for the Rabbis, Part 1 Origins. In episode 3.15, Tumultus Judaeorum, I recounted the tragedies that were the Kittos War and the Bar Kokhba revolt. Let's move on to happier times. In this episode, I explore, without much success I have to say, the history of the Jews and Judaism in the Roman Empire in the 70 years after the Bar Kokhba revolt. I lean on the broad shoulders of Donald Atkinson of Queen's University in Ontario and Dr. Brett C. Devereaux from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Catch up with them in my living bibliography at www.historyinthebible.com. I finish with the year 200, when solemn tradition holds that the mighty Mishnah was codified. The Mishnah is the redaction of Jewish law, passed down orally from generation to generation, supposedly from the time of Moses. At some point, and we do not know when, the rabbis decided that this oral tradition must be committed to parchment. The oldest complete manuscript of the Mishnah we have dates to 1000 CE, an eye-watering 800 years after its supposed oral compilation. The Mishnah is a weighty work. My English translation runs to 800 dense pages. Bring your reading glasses. Modern scholars disagree as to whether it is best regarded as a legal digest, a loose anthology of source material, or a study guide. Or all of those. This brusque work proved so enigmatic that centuries later the rabbis produced massive commentaries on the work, the Jerusalem and Babylonian Talmudim. The Tanakh, the Old Testament as Christians call it, insists that the temple and its priesthood, Jerusalem and the line of David are central to Judaism. Now there was no temple, no Jerusalem, and no Davidic king in sight. The rabbis looked beyond these earthly matters to the transcendental foundation of their religion, the contract that God had established with his people. Abraham was the first to sign on, then later Moses, and much later Kings David and Solomon. If the people kept their side of the arrangement, God would protect them. The rabbis decided that the best hope for their people was to articulate in detail the provisions of the pact. How could the people keep the contract if they did not understand its terms? The earliest product of their labours was the Mishnah. The Mishnah became Judaism's survival manual, one that freed them from the ancient bonds of geography. The rabbis believed that God had given to the rabbis of Moses' time a collection of laws not recounted in the Bible. These laws were passed down orally from rabbi to rabbi through the generations. The rabbis worked with fervour and diligence to restructure their religion so it could not only survive but prosper without the temple, without Jerusalem, and without a holy kingship. The 70 years between the Bar Kokhba revolt to the oral compilation of the Mishnah in 20 CE are a dark age for a professional historian of the Jews and Judaism, let alone an amateur buff such as myself. We have no Jewish historical accounts after the death of the historian Josephus and his rival Justus of Tiberias, around the year 100. and all we have from Justus are fragments preserved by later church fathers. Both Josephus and Justus wrote in Greek. Scholars used to hold that Greek-speaking Jewish culture disappeared after the 3 Jewish revolts. That is not quite right. But certainly no Jew thereafter wrote a literary work in Greek. Historians prize literary sources, long written texts. Those composed close to the events they describe are gold. We have innumerable contemporary documents that illuminate the early history of Christianity. Documents both Christian and pagan. Why no histories by Jews, or even letters, or any other sort of narratives? Were they lost? Were they actively destroyed? That is certainly a possibility after the Christians gained control of the empire in the late 4th century. But that would not explain why we have no long narratives written by the many Jews living in the Parthian and later the Sassanid empires. Perhaps Jewish intellectuals lost interest in long narratives and history. Perhaps they had better things to do with their time. New literary sources only turn up once in a blue moon. The massive hoard of the Dead Sea Scrolls was a once-in-a-century find. I discussed that treasure in episode 2.17, Recovering the Bible, a Century of Revelations. The scrolls revealed a wholly new aspect to the intellectual life of Judaism in the Second Temple period. They forced us to re-evaluate what we know about the Judaism and Christianity of the 1st century. The Dead Sea Scrolls show that the Judaism of the Second Temple period was much more varied than Josephus or the New Testament had led us to believe. The intellectual ocean of the time was awash with religious writings, a tiny fraction of which made it into the canon. Yet Jewish secular writings are virtually non-existent. We have nothing Jewish from the 2nd century that sheds any light on the history of the rabbis in this formative period. We are left to puzzle over inscriptions, words carved in stone or inscribed in metal. The fancy term is epigraphy. Jewish intellectuals ceased writing literary works in Greek after 100, but ordinary Jews crafted inscriptions in Greek and Latin for centuries after. Many Roman funerary inscriptions from Judea proudly describe the deceased as a priest. Very few mention a rabbi. Even then, we cannot know if that is a rabbi in the Mishnaic sense or a rabbi in the ancient general sense of a teacher. The rabbis are never portrayed as leaders. The inscriptions describe the community leaders as archontes, officials, archisynagogai, synagogue leaders, or gerusiarchai, councils of elders. Nor do the inscriptions that we have from the diaspora Jewish communities ever mention any specifically rabbinic ideas or practices. Usually, inscriptions are physically quite large, the size of a breadboard. Many of these inscriptions are laws, lists, or epitaphs. Here is one where a Jewish family lament the death of their daughter. The inscription begins in Latin. Quote, "Here rests Faustina, daughter of Faustinus the father, aged 14 years 5 months. She was her parents' only child. 2 apostles and 2 rabbis spoke the dirges for her, and she made great enough grief for her parents and tears for the community." End quote. The inscription finishes in Hebrew. Quote, "She was the daughter of Faustinus the father, granddaughter of Vitus and Asellus, who were leaders of the community." End quote. The delight of stone and metal inscriptions is that, unlike long literary works, new ones are unearthed all the time. There are 2 downsides to inscriptions. First, Stone and metal inscriptions can be very difficult to read. They are often damaged. They use abbreviations more often than whole words. And when they do use whole words, Greek and Latin writings usually run all the letters together. Mercifully, from a very early date, Hebrew very sensibly divided words by spaces, dots, or strokes. Here's an example from a Roman coin dated to about the year 90, the reign of the Emperor Domitian. The text around the edge of this coin is Imp Chaos Domit Aug Germ Cos 11 Kens Po DPP. That is shorthand for Imperator Caesar Domitianus Augustus Germanicus, consul for the 11th time, censor, Pontifex Maximus, tribune of the people. Roman coins are both common and easy to interpret. Their abbreviations have been familiar for centuries. Most other inscriptions are one-offs, sometimes using idiosyncratic abbreviations. And that is why specialists are needed to decide what abbreviation was lost in that big crack in the stone. Second, inscriptions only provide scraps of information. They are best used to corroborate or refute the long-form literary evidence. In the 1960s, for example, archaeologists working in Caesarea Maritima, the old Roman capital of the province of Judea, unearthed an inscription that mentioned Pontius Pilate. That's great, but we already knew of Pilate from both the New Testament and Josephus. Still, it was nice to find some physical evidence. After writing on stone and metal, we have writing on less durable materials. This mostly means papyrus and sometimes parchment. Parchments are animal skins, much more durable than papyrus in the right conditions. Historians call these writings paleographic objects. Only Egypt really has the dry conditions ideal for preserving papyrus. Most papyri are torn fragments, the size of a credit card. Parchment documents are often quite large. The Isaiah scroll from the Dead Sea Scrolls is an astonishing 7 meters long by 250 millimeters tall. That's 24 feet by 10 inches. There are hundreds of thousands of papyri fragments from Egypt, documenting every aspect of secular Egyptian life over centuries, let alone the Jewish and Christian texts we have found. But what we do not have is hundreds of papyrologists to read and interpret these precious fragments. If we never discovered another ancient papyrus again, papyrologists would still spend the next century deciphering the finds. After written items, we fall back on archaeology. In the 20th century, archaeologists discovered dozens of synagogues from the Roman and Byzantine periods. 120 were found in Palestine alone. Some of these had beautiful floor mosaics. They were a revelation. Apart from the Jewish symbols you would expect to see, some mosaics featured Greek gods, animals, and zodiacs. The wonderful thing about archaeological artifacts is that the more we unearth, the more useful the whole body becomes. Find one Roman synagogue with pagan symbols in a mosaic floor, and you have a wonder. Find 10, and you have a pattern that cries out for investigation. Archaeological evidence, unfortunately, is skewed by what is preserved and what lost. Best preserved are ceramics and stone, clay tablets and building materials. Metals are often melted down and reused. Wood and textiles rarely survive. Now, archaeology can tell us what people made. It tells us little about their social values, opinions, or beliefs. Were the synagogue mosaics with their Greek gods standard decoration? Or were they considered dangerously avant-garde? We do not know. The first job of the historian is to evaluate all these different sources. How reliable are they, and what is their particular viewpoint? Although we usually reserve these questions for long literary documents, we can also ask them about short texts, such as inscriptions and papyri. Take that inscription about the death of Faustina I mentioned. Did, and I quote, 2 apostles and 2 rabbis really speak dirges for her? Were her grandparents, Vitus and Asellus, really leaders of the community, or was that just a polite compliment? When we think about the reliability of a source, the basic question is the source likely telling you the truth? What are the author's motivations in writing? Consider the Roman Jewish historian Josephus, whom I have mentioned many times in this season. Josephus is our primary, and often only, source for the history of the Great Revolt and the province of Judea through to the year 100. Josephus makes it abundantly clear that he is a partisan of the Roman emperors who prosecuted the Great Revolt. Some historians therefore dismiss his works as worthless. Most say we must distill the dross from the gold. It is futile to search for some mythical objective source. As I said way back in my very first episode, objectivity is a phantom and a delusion. In historical studies, the word objective is thrown around to demonize one's opponents. I am nobly objective, but you are a malicious partisan with a vicious agenda to distort the truth for your own evil purposes. All sources are biased, even that little inscription about Faustina. Yet even sources that we believe are outright mistaken about the facts are useful. They are evidence for the author's own viewpoint and the viewpoints of people who thought like them. If some author has got the facts wrong, how many others of their time believed the same? Let's look at one passage from the Mishnah. In the Mishnah, the Pharisees are depicted as eternally bickering with the Sadducees. Quote, Mishnah Yadayim 4:7. The Sadducees say, "We complain against you, Pharisees, that you declare an uninterrupted flow of a liquid to be clean." The Pharisees say, "We complain against you, Sadducees, that you declare a stream of water which flows from a burial ground to be clean." End quote. In this passage, the Sadducees argue that to pour from a clean vessel into an unclean one by a continuous stream renders the water in the clean vessel impure, since the water becomes one continuous body of liquid. The Pharisees cite a precedent that water flowing from a cemetery is pure. So what's your problem? This may seem a very esoteric dispute, yet it so vexed Jews of the Second Temple period that it made its way into the Dead Sea Scrolls. This passage, compiled about the year 200, makes some general remarks about the Sadducees. We have to first ask, were the compilers of the Mishnah in a position to know about the Sadducees and to know of the Sadducees? As far as we know, the Sadducees had exited stage left 120 years earlier. The further in time a source is removed from events, the less reliable we must hold it. Josephus was a witness to the Great Revolt, so he gets an A+ for that, although a B- for bias. The Mishnaic rabbis were 120 years distant from the events they relate. Now that may sound a long time, but compared to ancient sources in general, 120 years is almost contemporaneous. But then we have to ask questions about the rabbi's viewpoint. How do the rabbi's clear dislike of the Sadducees' religious opinions influence their attitudes to them? Such are the questions historians ask. Where do the rabbis come from? The first chapter of the Mishnah's tractate, Pirkei Avot, makes a stab at constructing a lengthy chain of rabbinic transmission. This has as much credibility as the patriarchal genealogy in Genesis. The rabbis can really only claim a memory that runs back to Herod the Great. Recognizing the shakiness of this pedigree, the Mishnah rests its authority neither on this chain of sages or Moses. The origins of the rabbis are mysterious. Perhaps they are the scribes that the New Testament rails against. Modern scholars believe that the rabbis were transmuted Pharisees. Yet the rabbis never claimed an association with the Pharisees. Perhaps because the rabbis claimed to represent all Israel from the time of Moses. They could hardly recognize a named political party and sect as their predecessors. If the rabbis are descended from the Pharisees, as most scholars cautiously hold, they show scant interest in the basic beliefs of their predecessors. We can reasonably be sure that the Pharisees believed in the efficacy of repentance, the resurrection of the dead, and a celestial reward and punishment. They also thought a triumphant Messiah would save Judah from the impositions of the imperial power and restore God's covenant with the people. But except for the odd paragraph, the Mishnah is not interested in any of these. The Mishnah only believes that there will be a future world, a world to come, and that God supervises human affairs. Without the Mishnah's references to the house of Gamaliel, noted in the New Testament as a Pharisee, we would have little reason to connect the rabbis to the Pharisees. Modern scholars also happily welcome the notion that the Essenes and the priestly caste had a part to play. After all, the rabbis share with those two groups a preoccupation with ritual and purity, and a fervent dedication to the interpretation of religious texts. But unlike the Essenes and the priests, the rabbis not only permitted but encouraged divergent opinions. For 50 years, scholars have argued furiously about the importance of the rabbis in the centuries after the fall of the temple. The ancient opinion of the rabbis themselves was that by the Bar Kokhba revolt, 2 generations after the destruction of the temple, the rabbis had replaced the priests and the Levites as the custodians of the religion in the Judean homeland. Most modern professors argue that the rabbis were a fringe group for many centuries, no more important than the Essenes had been in the Second Temple period. Until around maybe the year 400, the rabbis were just a few disconnected study groups scattered throughout Judea and Mesopotamia. The rabbis had to contend for authority with the remnants of the elites who had survived the 3 revolts, the wealthy, the aristocracy, and the priests and Levites. We know little about the social structure of the rabbis. The best we can glean is that an early rabbi taught in a purpose-built structure, a study hall or Beit Midrash. Perhaps they timeshared. Students, all men of course, were free to move to rabbis they found more amiable. Apart from that, how were the rabbis organized? What was their relationship to each other and the community? Did their legal rulings carry any weight with the civil leader of the Jews, the patriarch or Nasi, resident in Galilee? Could the rabbis actually enforce their rulings? We have no evidence that rabbis attended annual rabbicons to buy rabbinic merchandise. The evidence of the Mishnah implies a dispersed network of sages attended by disciple circles with little institutional organization. Now, this was a common model for advanced education in the ancient world. The Christians created a different teacher-pupil model. Christians met covertly in private houses. They had little choice. The Romans regarded Christianity as an illicit and dangerous religion. A Christian congregation had as many women as men. the little underground club was visited by itinerant preachers like Paul. Once they found a preacher they liked, the congregation tended to stick with them. Unlike the rabbis, the Christians somehow constructed a robust and integrated international organisation, the Church Imperial. I have much more to say about that in later episodes. Rabbis in the Mishnaic sense, as opposed to just teachers, are invisible in the many works we have in Hebrew, Aramaic or Greek from the period. No Greek or Latin work refers to the Mishnaic rabbis until 200 years after Christianity was made the state religion, the 5th century. There is no evidence that Mishnaic thought had the slightest impact in the many Jewish communities scattered through the Roman Empire. The facts of the Kittos War testify to the anger Jews in the eastern Mediterranean harboured about the destruction of the temple. But in the aftermath of that terrible insurrection, did the diaspora buy what the rabbis were selling? It seems not. Scholars nowadays suspect that the priestly clans were the effective leaders in their communities and in synagogues. The venerable scholar Daniel Boyarin argues that synagogues were especially difficult places for the rabbis to penetrate. As I discussed in episode 3.3, before the Great Revolt Part 1, the Judeans, the synagogues were inventions of the Hellenistic states, established 400 years before we hear a peep about the rabbis. The clue is in the name. Synagogue is a Greek word. Synagogues were created by Jewish laypeople. Some were funded by pagan supporters. By the time of the Great Revolt, synagogues were dotted across the eastern Mediterranean. They were prayer halls, a school, and social centres, places of popular piety. The Mishnah is not interested in either prayer or the synagogues. Since the rabbis had no influence over the synagogues, they encouraged the people to pray in rabbinical study halls. The Jewish people were reluctant to accept their invitations. Centuries would pass before the rabbis prevailed over their Second Temple predecessors. The rabbis eventually succeeded by absorbing their rivals. All the rabbis required was that everyone abandon the fervid factionalism that had destroyed the nation in 3 futile rebellions. Unity was the name of the game. In the next episode, I talk a little more about the greatest achievement of the early rabbis, the mighty Mishnah. Thanks for visiting. For show notes, maps, charts, and timelines, visit my website at www.historyinthebible.com. You can even download professional posters for free.